The Galactic Empire had conquered countless worlds. Their method was efficient: overwhelm the enemy, force surrender, and assimilate. Resistance was rare. Most species understood that pain and injury meant death. It was logical to yield when survival was no longer possible. That was the way of war. That was the way of the universe. Then, they encountered humans. At first, they seemed unremarkable. Their biology was fragile: soft flesh, brittle bones, and internal organs exposed beneath a thin layer of skin. No natural armor, no redundant systems. Unlike the hardened exoskeletons of the Kthari or the regenerative abilities of the Vashik, humans appeared biologically inefficient. Easy to subdue. Easy to break. The Empire launched a campaign against an Outer Rim human colony, expecting quick capitulation. A simple planetary assault: drop troops, establish superiority, and demand surrender. But something was wrong. The humans did not break. Even as plasma fire cut through their ranks, even as explosions tore through their defenses, they fought. That wasn't unusual. Every species tried, at first. But humans kept fighting. They fought long past the point where any logical being would have given up. They fought even when survival was mathematically impossible. The Imperial commander observed the battlefield from his warship. His forces were superior in number, technology, and firepower. Victory was certain. Yet, below him, he watched a sight that disturbed him deeply. A human soldier had taken a direct hit, his side burned, his armor cracked, blood spilling onto the ground. A wound like that should have ended him. He should have collapsed, incapacitated by pain, waiting for the inevitable. That was what any rational species would do. But the human didn't stop. He dragged himself to cover, gripping his rifle with shaking hands. His breath was ragged, his body failing, but his finger tightened on the trigger. Plasma fire erupted from his weapon, cutting down advancing Imperial troops. The commander's second-in-command, a seasoned strategist, stared in disbelief. He should be dead. The commander did not answer. He watched as the wounded human adjusted his stance, pressing his injured side against a rock to stabilize himself. His hands were slick with blood, his movements slower, but he fought as if nothing had changed. This wasn't a last stand. This wasn't a desperate burst of adrenaline before death. This was something else. Imperial soldiers hesitated. Their combat training had no protocol for this. They had been taught that pain was a deterrent, that wounds meant surrender or retreat. But the humans, this human, treated pain as an inconvenience. More reports came in. Other humans, wounded beyond reason, were still in the fight. Some bandaged themselves mid-battle, others used their injuries as bait to lure enemies closer. The Empire had faced many enemies before, but none like this. The commander's unease deepened. For the first time in his career, he found himself wondering. Had they made a mistake? Sergeant Cole's vision blurred as pain tore through his side. The plasma shot had burned deep, the edges of the wound still glowing with residual heat. Every breath sent a sharp agony through his ribs, but he forced himself to stay upright. His rifle was still functional. His hands were still steady enough to fire. That was all that mattered. The enemy thought he was done. He could see it in the way they moved, cautious, expecting him to collapse at any moment. But he wasn't going down. Not yet. He adjusted his grip, bracing his wounded side against the jagged rock beside him. The pressure sent another wave of pain through his body, but he gritted his teeth and ignored it. The only thing that mattered was the fight. Across the battlefield, the Imperial troops hesitated. Their formation wavered as their focus shifted from overwhelming the enemy to something more uncertain. Cole wasn't the only one still fighting through injuries. Others had taken hits, some worse than him, but they kept moving, kept shooting. He spotted a fellow soldier, her leg shredded by shrapnel, crawling toward a better firing position. Another, blood streaking down his face, dragged a wounded comrade to cover while still returning fire. This wasn't just battle instinct. This was something deeper, something the enemy didn't understand. The Imperials were starting to break. Their weapons were superior. Their armor was stronger. But they had never faced an enemy that refused to fall. Cole exhaled slowly, forcing himself to focus. His side was numb now, not from the wound closing, but from sheer exhaustion. That was fine. He just needed to hold out a little longer. A figure appeared in his sights, an Imperial officer, standing farther back, issuing frantic orders. Cole steadied his aim. His hands ached, his fingers barely obeying, but he pulled the trigger. The plasma bolt struck home, sending the officer sprawling. The enemy's hesitation turned to panic. He felt a shadow pass over him. An Imperial soldier had charged forward, thinking him weakened, thinking him vulnerable. Cole reacted instantly, swinging his rifle up. The butt of the weapon cracked against the alien's face, sending the soldier crashing to the ground. Cole didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Pain meant nothing. Blood loss meant nothing. He had seen humans push through worse. He had seen men fight with broken limbs, with collapsed lungs, with nothing but sheer defiance keeping them alive. That was the difference. The Empire saw wounds as the end. Humans saw them as just another obstacle. He caught movement in his peripheral vision. More Imperials were retreating, their formation collapsing under the pressure. The battlefield had shifted. What should have been an easy victory was now a desperate attempt to survive. Cole tightened his grip on his weapon and pushed forward. The fight wasn't over yet. The Imperial forces were breaking. What had started as a calculated assault was unraveling into chaos. Their troops, conditioned to expect swift victories, were hesitating, their movements no longer coordinated. The humans should have fallen by now. The wounded should have been out of the fight. But they weren't. Sergeant Cole wasn't the only one still standing. He could hear the ragged shouts of his squad, see them pressing forward despite their injuries. Some should have been unconscious from blood loss, yet they fought like men possessed. The Empire's commander saw it too. His orders became frantic, demanding his troops to regroup, to push back, but the fear had already set in. He had underestimated the effect of watching humans refuse to die. It was not just their bodies that endured, it was their will. A human soldier took a direct hit to the shoulder but barely staggered before returning fire. Another, limping from a shattered knee, still moved with purpose, covering his squadmates' advance. Every battle doctrine the Empire had relied on was failing. The logic that governed warfare for centuries no longer applied. The humans weren't winning because they were stronger. They were winning because they didn't accept defeat. Cole's breathing was shallow now, each movement sending fresh agony through his side, but he didn't care. He saw an opening, enemy troops faltering, stepping back, breaking formation. He didn't hesitate. He surged forward, and others followed. The Imperial line collapsed. Some dropped their weapons and fled, others tried to fight but were cut down before they could regain their composure. Panic spread like wildfire. They had the numbers, they had the technology, but none of it mattered against an enemy that refused to stop. The commander watched in horror as his forces fell apart. His soldiers were not weak. They were trained, disciplined. But they had never faced something like this. They had never fought an enemy that saw pain as an inconvenience, that treated injury as just another part of battle. Cole pushed forward, ignoring the burning in his lungs, the wet warmth of blood soaking his armor. The fight was almost over. The Imperials were retreating in full, their will to fight shattered. One by one, their ships lifted off the ground, abandoning the battlefield. It wasn't a strategic withdrawal. It was fear. Cole exhaled, lowering his weapon slightly as he watched them flee. It was over. They had won. Not because they had better weapons. Not because they had superior numbers. But because they were human. The battlefield was silent. Smoke drifted through the air, the scent of scorched earth and blood lingering. The Imperial forces were gone, retreating into orbit, leaving behind only the wreckage of their failed conquest. Sergeant Cole let out a slow breath, finally allowing himself to acknowledge the pain. His side was a mess of burned flesh and dried blood, his limbs heavy with exhaustion. But he was alive. They all were. The victory wasn't just in holding the ground. It was in what came after. Word would spread. The Empire had faced resistance before, but never like this. Never against an enemy that refused to break. On board the Imperial warship, the commander sat in silence. His hands trembled slightly as he reviewed the battle logs. His forces had superior numbers, superior weapons, superior everything. And yet, they had lost. Not because they were outgunned, but because they were outlasted. He replayed the footage of the humans fighting through injuries that should have incapacitated them. He saw soldiers pressing forward with broken bones, saw one dragging himself across the ground with a shattered leg just to fire one more shot. It defied reason. It defied logic. Pain was supposed to be a deterrent. Wounds were supposed to end a fight. But humans didn't see it that way. They fought until there was nothing left. And somehow, even then, they kept going. Reports were already spreading across the fleet. Soldiers whispered about the creatures that didn't stop, about the nightmare of facing an enemy that refused to die. The fear had taken root. A transmission came through, cutting through the silence of the command deck. A human voice, calm but firm. "You think pain stops us? You have no idea what we're capable of." The message ended, but the words lingered. The Empire had made a mistake. They had assumed humans were fragile. They had assumed they could be broken. Now they knew the truth. And they feared it,